So I want to introduce our next speaker, a person who's known to a lot of you, I have no doubt, because we know just from the level of interest in his work that it's someone that I know this audience is very excited to hear from. I'm talking about Adam Grant. Now, for those who don't know, I want to contextualize this conversation and why we're so excited that Adam is going to be giving his expertise into what we're talking about this year. He's been Wharton's top-rated professor for 7 straight years. He's an organisational psychologist and a leading expert on motivation, rethinking assumptions, and living more generous and creative lives. He's recognised as one of the 10 most influential management thinkers and one of Fortune's 40 under 40. He's a multiple times New York Times best-selling author, 5 books in fact, including titles that you would probably know. Books like Think Again, Give and Take, Originals, Option B, and Power Moves. His books have been translated into over 45 languages. We're really thrilled to have him joining us today. Can you please welcome Adam Grant? The power of hologram technology, would you believe it? Adam, it's wonderful to have you here with us. Thank you for being a part of Energy Disruptors 2022.
I'm thrilled to be here, Holly. I grew up actually driving south across the border to Canada, but I have never crossed it by hologram before.
I was thinking if you put me on the gram, you've got a hologram and then a hologram. So we're kind of double acting it here, which is really nice. Adam, thank you for being here. I wanted to kick off our conversation with a tweet from you earlier this month, actually, where you wrote, that's my opinion and I'm sticking to it, a phrase we hear pretty often, is a self-limiting way to live. People who never let go of their views never evolve. And then you added that growth is not just about embracing new ideas, it's about rethinking old ones. Can you talk a little bit about the power of rethinking?
Yeah, I even agree with what I wrote, although I reserve the right to rethink it, which I think would just reinforce the point that I'm trying to make. I have watched too many leaders in too many organizations fall into a very simple trap that's called escalation of commitment to a losing course of action, where you form an opinion or you make a decision, it does not go as you hoped, but instead of rethinking it, you double down and invest more time, more money, more energy, more resources. I'm still sad that the BlackBerry keyboard isn't available anymore, right? Which was a case of escalation of commitment to an idea that worked in the past, but unfortunately the world had changed. And I think if the world stood still, it would be fine to form an opinion and then stick to it. But you all know as energy disruptors that we live in a rapidly changing world where many of the best practices that we picked in the past were actually built for a world that doesn't exist anymore. And I think we have to be willing to question those best practices and look for better ones. And ultimately, the leaders who are in the best position to change the world are the ones who adapt most quickly to changing circumstances.
So can you unpack for us a little bit the psychology of why we're so hardwired to escalating to a losing course of action, as you said? Why is it so difficult? Why do we resist rethinking so much?
Well, when a lot of people hear about escalation of commitment, they think about sunk costs. But if you look at the data, the most powerful drivers are not economic, they're emotional. Ego and image get in the way. I don't want to look in the mirror and see an idiot staring back at me. I definitely don't want you to think I'm an idiot either. And so I work really hard to rationalize and justify my prior beliefs and decisions to convince myself and everybody else that I was right all along. And obviously that's a scary way to live. And I think one of the habits that really causes us to get stuck there is too many of us spend too much of our time thinking like preachers, prosecutors, or politicians. This is something I've been studying lately that we see a lot in the climate and energy space. So when you're in preacher mode, you're basically proselytizing your own views. When you're in prosecutor mode, you're attacking somebody else's views. And if you go into politician mode, you don't even bother to listen to people unless they already agree with your views.
There's a lot of knowing laughter.
So I would love to pull the audience to get a sense of how many preachers, prosecutors, and politicians we have here. We all slip into each of these modes from time to time, but most of us have one that's a bigger vice than the others. And I'll just tell you first, Holly, my biggest vice is prosecutor mode. If I think you're wrong, I feel it's my professional responsibility as a social scientist and my moral responsibility as a human being to correct you, which strangely never goes well. And I know that when I start prosecuting, you either disengage from the conversation altogether or you bring your best defense attorney to court and then we just butt heads and nobody changes their mind. So I'm trying to get out of that habit, but Let's go to the audience.
Yeah,
Can we get a
let's
show
have
of hands? How many of you tend to be fellow prosecutors
Who's
like
in the
me
prosecutor
more
camp? Hands
often
up.
than you would like?
I'd probably sit in that camp too, I think. Who's a preacher in the
Interesting.
room? Adam's got a feed to the room too, so you can see these hands going up. Brilliant. Who's a politician? Anyone prepared to admit that? We do actually have a few actual politicians in the room. They've at least got to put their hands up. Anyone else? So interestingly, that was our least well-attended category of people. So there you go, fair split between
Always.
prosecutors
No one wants
and
to admit
preachers.
it.
Yeah. So you argue that we need...
So
sorry, I was just going to say, you argue that we need to think more like a scientist. Can you explain why that's the hat you think we need to wear more often?
Yeah, I think the danger of preaching, prosecuting, and politicking is that you've already concluded that you're right and other people are wrong. So they need to think again, but you have already seen the light. And I should say as an aside, somebody asked me recently, is there anything worse than preaching, prosecuting, or politicking all the time? And the only thing I could think of was being a cult leader. Although my wife then told me she actually is always right. So I don't know what to do with that. But my favorite alternative to those modes is to think more like a scientist. And when I say think like a scientist, I do not mean that you need to own a microscope or invest in a telescope. I would like it if Canada offered an annual Bill Nye Day. But for me, thinking like a scientist means you don't let your ideas become part of your identity. That you are as motivated to look for reasons why you might be wrong as you are to search for reasons why you must be right. And we all know that good scientists have the humility to know what they don't know and the curiosity to seek new knowledge. They recognize that every opinion they hold is just a hunch. It's a hypothesis waiting to be tested. And every decision they make is an experiment, only most of the time we forgot to have a control group. It's like you ran an A/B test, except you didn't have a B. You just implemented the A. And we know that when we teach leaders to think more like scientists, they become more willing to think again, and they actually make better decisions.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. You mentioned you've been doing a lot of research on the different buckets people fall into, particularly around climate change in that answer just then. And earlier this year, you did a presentation where you actually made a parallel between climate change and the frog in the pot of hot water. Can you expand on that analogy that you drew a little bit more?
I can try. So I think everybody's familiar with the story of what happens when you drop a frog in hot water. If you drop it in scalding water, the frog is of course immediately going to recognize the danger and jump out. Whereas if you put it in a slow boiling pot, the frog doesn't have the ability to rethink the situation and doesn't notice that the warm bath has become a death trap until it is too late. Well, I ended up reading about the origins of this story, and I found out that it isn't true. It's a myth. The frog actually has the ability to think again. The moment the water gets uncomfortably hot, it will leap out. Whereas humans, right? We hear the story, we accept it as true, and we don't bother to question it or rethink it. And I think for a lot of people, right, the original parable matches up with what we're seeing with climate change, right? Which is that maybe the planet is a slow boiling pot, and we weren't quick enough to notice the danger that we were causing. But my worry there is that too often then, we get attached to the early diagnoses of the problem that we made or the initial solutions that we've started to get excited about, and then we preach those. We prosecute everybody who's a naysayer against them. We politic by lobbying people who basically agree with us to stick with the status quo, and we don't ultimately learn, evolve, or change. And I would hate to see this happen, especially with a group of leaders who are here to disrupt.
I want to pick up on your point around humility earlier, because I think this notion of humble and adaptive leadership is something that's absolutely critical to the energy transition we're gathered here to talk about. I loved a quote from you where you said there's a fine line between heroic persistence and stubborn stupidity. I wanted to ask you, in a world that glorifies hustle and grit, how do we normalize admitting we're wrong?
Well, I think probably the most useful insight I got on this came from Danny Kahneman, who probably many of you know from Thinking Fast and Slow. He's the psychologist who won the Nobel Prize for his work on decision heuristics and biases. So if you've ever talked about confirmation bias or anchoring, that's Danny's language in your head. I was a couple years ago giving a presentation, and I finished the talk, I'm walking out, and I see that Danny is sitting in the audience. This is the closest I will ever come to winning a Nobel Prize. I stop and say hi to him and thank him for gracing me with his genius. And he says to me, "That was wonderful. I was wrong." And his eyes are lighting up, he's smiling, and Danny's a very pessimistic guy. This is a little bit out of character for him. And I track him down later and sit down with him for lunch. I said, Danny, it looked to me like you enjoy being wrong, but that can't be. And I want to talk to you about the joy of being wrong because I've never seen it before. And as you'd expect from a Nobel laureate, Danny corrected me. And he said, no, I don't enjoy being wrong. I don't know anybody who enjoys being wrong. That is not fun. But I do enjoy finding out that I was wrong because it means I am now less wrong than I was before. And all of a sudden it hit me. This is why I got so excited about organizational psychology to begin with. I loved reading studies that turned my assumptions upside down. And it was a rush to realize I was discovering something new. And I came to recognize, I said to Danny, when I find out I was wrong, it means I learned something. And Danny said, finding out that I was wrong is the only way I'm sure that I learned anything. And I think the lesson here is that the faster you are to recognize you're wrong, the faster you can move toward getting it right, which last time I checked is the goal. But I think a lot of leaders still shy away from admitting that they were wrong because they think it's going to threaten their competence or it's going to maybe call into question their image. The reality is, I've actually been studying this for a few years, and in experiments, when I randomly assign leaders or managers to say, I was wrong, I screwed that up, I made a mistake, people actually trust them more because they say, wow, you are secure enough in your strengths to admit your weaknesses. You are confident enough in your knowledge to admit what you don't know. And so there's a real confident humility that comes with saying, I was wrong. It tells people that you believe in your capability to get it right. And it also shows them that they can count on you to tell them the truth.
It's interesting that comment Adam made about humility there, because when we polled everyone this morning, Adam, we asked all the audience to generate the word that they associate with the brave leadership and the social transition that we need to see more of. And trust came out as the largest word on that word cloud. And so that link between humility and trust is a really interesting thing to tease out. It also strikes me in what you're talking about that there's a really interesting kind of overlap here, isn't there, between mindset and habits. You know, part of this is sort of the habits make us. And I'm thinking about things that almost hardwire us into ruts, like not taking on feedback, that surrounding ourselves with the same types of people who agree with us. Any suggestions on habits that can actually support? If I'm sitting here and I'm going, geez, I could do a bit of a better job at rethinking, what would you suggest I do from a structural approach in my life to bring that more to bear day to day, week to week?
I think you might want to start with rethinking your network. So I'm sure we've all been encouraged to build a support network. Right? Everybody in this room, every single energy disruptor here with us today has colleagues, mentors, sponsors who have your back and cheerlead for you. But rethinking hinges on a different kind of network, which I've come to think of as a challenge network. Your challenge network is the group of thoughtful critics who you trust to hold up a mirror so you can see your own blind spots more clearly. They are the people who, instead of lining up to feed you comforting lies, actually have the courage to tell you the unpleasant truths. And I don't think we see enough of this. I've actually worked in organizations where the leader walks in and says, good morning. And a bunch of people are ready to say, great point, right? Which is not exactly likely to challenge your assumptions and your thinking. The challenge network is often a group of people who are kind of on the disagreeable end of the personality spectrum. So if we look at the major personality traits around the world, Holly, we know agreeable people as warm, friendly, polite, welcoming, Canadian.
Sounds about right.
Disagreeable people, more critical, skeptical, also overrepresented among lawyers and engineers, which is not a joke, that's an empirical finding. And the problem with agreeable people is they're great at the support network skill, right? They love to praise us and reinforce that what we're doing is working. They love social harmony, but they're often hesitant to question us, right? They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to hurt our ego or damage the relationship. They want to keep the peace. And that means they hesitate to tell us what to rethink. It is frequently the disagreeable people in our networks who are the most likely to give us the critical feedback we may not want to hear, but we desperately need to hear. And of course, you have to pay attention to their motives. Right? You don't want to spend that much time learning from disagreeable takers who are maybe trying to shoot you down for their own gain. But disagreeable givers, people who are gruff and tough on the surface, but doing it because they want to help. People who dish out tough love. If we have any Ted Lasso fans in the room, the Roy Kents of the world, those are the people that you can rely on, right? To help you see the things that you need to rethink. And the challenge is to make sure that they feel comfortable giving you that feedback, because even disagreeable people sometimes worry about jeopardizing the relationship.
I want to ask you about the way that that extends. You know, there's an individual practice piece to this, and then there's the notion of how we need to build culture and practice around rethinking collectively in our companies and in our organisations. Can you speak about how leaders can do a better job of role modelling that? Because it strikes me that, in part, what you've just talked about, giving permission for that to be a part of the conversation, role modelling feedback plays a role in it. But I know you've got some quite specific examples of things you've been involved in implementing in different organisations.
I do. One of the mistakes I see a lot of leaders make is they come in and they say, don't bring me blank, bring me blank. So think about a boss you had at some point in your career who loved to say that, and we're going to fill in the blanks out loud. Ready? Don't bring me
problems. Oh, I'm intrigued. There's a lot of laughter in one corner. Solutions.
Don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. I get why leaders say this. You want people to take initiative and be constructive, not to whine and complain. But Holly, I've come to believe this is a dangerous philosophy, because if people can only speak up when they have a solution, you will never hear the biggest problems, which are too complex for any one person to solve. If you want to hear what people really think and what you need to rethink, you need to encourage them to raise problems, even if they don't know how to fix them yet. That empowers the canaries in the coal mine, who are good at detecting threats, to surface them even if they lack the authority or the perceived expertise to do something about them. So how do you make that real? There are a couple things you can do. One is you can take the old idea of a suggestion box, rethink it, and turn it into a problem box. I've seen this done at Bridgewater and at Warby Parker, where anytime you see something broken, it could be a technical bug, a management bug, a culture bug, you can submit that, and then people actually vote on how important the problems are. And if you want to work on one of the highly rated problems, you get a team around you, resources behind you, and you can make it part of your job to do that. I think, though, we also need to make cultural change, not just structural change. We need to give people the psychological safety, as Amy Edmondson would define it in her research, to say, hey, you know what? I have a concern, without fear that they're going to get punished. And what most leaders do to try to establish that psychological safety is they ask for feedback. They say, my door is open. You know, if you see something, say something. The problem is, when you make that statement, I don't know if you mean it. I don't know if you're going to bite my head off. I don't know if you're going to be too busy to listen to me. Right? There's a lot of uncertainty, so I might still hesitate, or I might sugarcoat. What I've found is much more effective is when leaders criticize themselves out loud. So let's look at a couple examples of this. I had a chance to serve on the Defense Innovation Board at the Pentagon for a few years. And one of the people I had the privilege of serving with was Admiral Bill McRaven. If you're not familiar with Admiral McRaven's leadership, he led the bin Laden raid and also the capture of Saddam Hussein. He was the most decorated person in every room I walked into. And despite that, or maybe because of it, he was the first person to say, if you think I'm making a bad decision or I'm about to make a mistake, it is your responsibility to let me know. And he got loud because he's a Navy SEAL, and that's what they do. He said, listen, I believe in accountability, and I expect you to hold me accountable. I need you to protect me from myself. And he would talk about his weaknesses, his shortcomings. He would say, I've been told I have a bad habit of collecting strays, that when I get attached to somebody on my command, I don't want to let them go, even if they're not qualified for the role they're in. And we can't have that happening. It could jeopardize the mission. So if you see me doing that, it is up to you to call me out right away. And that is the kind of leadership behavior that opens the door for people to tell you what they really think and what you need to rethink.
I love that example. I can only imagine hearing that delivered in a Navy SEAL tone, though you did a really good job of that impersonation. I wanted to ask you too, I feel like one of the resistance people often think, but just to double down on the problem for a bit, is yeah, but if we're focusing on the problem, do we breed this culture that says it's not my job, not my responsibility, where that solution orientation often means we've got a more empowered culture, people have a sense that we're expecting them to take initiative. Do we worry that we end up in problem glorification and admiration?
Possibly. I think that's a good critique, but I think that raising problems is only the first phase of this process, right? Then the question is, who has the motivation and is willing to develop the capacity to try to solve these problems? And there's no reason why you can't do these two pieces together. I think one of the things we need to be aware of is if we jump to solutions too soon, we actually get less support. So there's research on this in the climate arena. Troy Campbell and his colleagues have done research on what they call solution aversion, which is the idea that if I pitch you a solution to a problem and you don't like my solution, your first impulse is just to ignore the problem altogether. Right? We're seeing this happen all over the world right now around climate change. And what happens there is people say, you know what, this, the solution you're proposing is a threat to my way of life, or it's expensive, or it's time consuming, or it involves a lot of uncertainty. And so I'd just rather deny the problem altogether. If we could build consensus about what the problem is, it's a lot harder for people to reject that. And then we can start moving toward, okay, let's generate some hypotheses about viable solutions. Let's run a series of experiments. And let's agree on what a successful outcome would look like. And then we'll place our bets. And whichever experiment gets the results that we agree are important, we're then going to invest in that experiment.
Adam, I want to change tact if I can for a moment, and I've got a rapid-fire 5 questions completely in a tangential territories that I want to explore with you, because I think it's really important we get some of the breadth of your work in this conversation, even though I really want to focus us on the energy transition at hand for the majority of our conversation. So first question, at age 29, you were a professional magician. What was your signature trick?
It was called the 654 Club. I used to take a deck of cards, shuffle it, give it to the audience to cut it, and I would tell a story with the entire deck of cards where basically each line of the story had a card come up, and so I was able to produce the whole deck in order.
Nice, very impressive. What's a habit that you've established for yourself that you would say has been personally game-changing for you?
Oh, I have a lot of habits that I think have been effective. Game-changing, a really simple one. Every time I do any performance, whether it's a speech or a podcast episode or a book chapter draft, I ask my audience to rate it on a scale from 0 to 10. And whether they give me a 7.5 or a 2, my question is, what can I do to get closer to 10? And I find that people are much more candid with their feedback once I've asked for the rating and I've shown that I'm not really interested in trying to prove myself. I am here to improve myself. So, Holly, you're going to get an email after this asking for the 0 to 10 and what I can do to get closer to 10.
I'll be ready and waiting, and I can say Adam does do that. That's for sure. I know that to be true. What's the most surprising conversation? I just got your email recently. Many of you will have too. You've got a really exciting new podcast that you've just come out with. What conversational insight was most surprising for you in the series you've just finished recording? Got an incredible array of guests.
Yeah, so we just launched Rethinking, and I think one of the biggest surprises for me that's come out so far was an insight that I got from Brené Brown, actually. It was the very first episode we did on this show, and I was asking her about what has surprised her from a leadership standpoint. And she said the people who really taught her about the importance of emotion in leadership were military leaders, who said, there was one in particular in the Air Force in the US, who said, you cannot lead people who you don't have affection for. And that just completely turned upside down my idea of, the stoic, rational military commander. And I think if emotion matters there, it's got to matter everywhere.
Yeah, great point. And connects with your Navy SEAL friend who liked to collect strays too. What did being a junior Olympic springboard diver teach you?
Well, I was afraid of heights when I started diving, and I was
feels like a challenge, doesn't it?
I was supposed to walk. I mean, not a good sport to choose, right? If you're afraid of heights, I found out later I wasn't afraid of falling. I was afraid of dying. But in diving, it's pretty painful to land flat on your back when you're going about 30 miles an hour, and I would just stand there at the edge of the board, shaking, afraid to try new dives. And my coach Eric Best would ask me, Adam, are you going to do this dive? I'd be like, ever? Yes, I do plan to do this at some point. And he would say, great, what are you waiting for? And that rings in my head every time I'm afraid of trying something new. I hear Eric's voice saying, are you going to do this one day? And the answer is yes. And then the question is, what am I waiting for?
I love that. Final one of my rapid 5. I wanted to ask you, what have you listened to or read in the last 12 months that's challenged you?
A lot. I loved Bo Sio's book, which just came out, called Good Arguments.
Great book.
He's a debate champion, world debate champion, and he argues that debate is actually not about arguing. It's about listening and being curious and humble to try to learn from the person you're disagreeing with. And that was pretty game-changing.
Love it. Fellow Australian too, so very, very proud that he got a shout out there. That's great. I want to talk to you a little bit about depolarization. And again, I'm going to come back to one of your tweets to ground us in it. You've said the main reason people reject science isn't actually political ideology, it's a lack of critical thinking. Data across the political spectrum, more sophisticated thinkers were generally more accurate in evaluating evidence. And you said teaching reasoning is a key to depolarization. How do we teach reasoning?
I don't know, I just study this. Good luck. It's hard. No, I don't have a magic bullet here, but I think the research you were just referencing is hot off the presses. It just came out a few months ago, and it does turn out that people who are more sophisticated critical thinkers are more likely even to overcome confirmation bias. They're more open to listening to and learning from science that even disagrees with some of their core beliefs. And so I've been really curious about what we can do to teach these reasoning skills, and especially to teach them in our schools. I think that's where they're most sorely needed. And I think one of the mistakes that a lot of teachers make is they try to introduce facts, and they basically treat those as gospel. And I've made that mistake in my own classroom. I teach evidence-based leadership and management. And for years, I would basically say to students, look, we're trying to use medicine as a gold standard. I think the extra life that we've gotten in the last century because of evidence-based medicine is pretty good for the human race. And I would like to apply the same standards of rigor to studying leadership and management. So we're going to use randomized controlled trials. We're going to have longitudinal studies. We're going to use meta-analyses to accumulate the results across these studies and correct for the biases in the individual studies and look at what works for most of the people most of the time. And about halfway through the semester one year, a student came to me and said, you talk a lot about being willing to think again, but we don't ever get to challenge your data because we don't have those data. That's a very good point. And I realized what I was failing to do is something that a lot of teachers fail to do, which is I wasn't highlighting the uncertainty, what we don't know. I wasn't giving students a chance to take a question and say, how would I design my own experiment to try to get to the bottom of this? And so I think that's something we ought to do from the get-go, right? Is you can make a list of all your core beliefs and then ask what evidence would change your mind, and then go out and search for that evidence.
One of the reasons I was really interested to ask you about this topic is because obviously one of the ways you could view the energy conversation at the moment is that it's polarized, or that there's certainly pockets that disagree with one another and find it difficult to sit and listen and be challenged by one another and potentially explore the collaborative opportunity that sits somewhere in the middle as well. And it reminded me of something that you talked about that I really liked in Think Again, where you talked about constructive conflict. And you said you encouraged us to view disagreements as a dance and not a duel. Can you talk us through the psychology of constructive conflict?
I can try. So as an agreeable person, I avoided conflict most of my life. And that was because I was thinking about relationship conflict, which is the personal, emotional, I hate your guts and I wish I didn't have to interact with you sort of conflict. And not surprisingly, that turns out to be destructive in all sorts of ways. But there's another flavor of conflict, which is called task conflict, which is when we disagree about visions, ideas, and decisions. And that's much more cognitive than it is emotional. It's really about how we view the world, not about our personalities or values clashing. It's about trying to maybe even find the best answer to a question, or we disagree about how to discover the truth about a problem that's important to both of us. And I think what we want to do is not reduce the net amount of disagreement we have. We want to increase how constructive those disagreements are. And that means trying to minimize relationship conflict and increase task conflict. So there is evidence that if you say, can we debate, people are a little bit less likely to take it personally, because they realize, oh, we're supposed to disagree and duke it out, and that's good. The problem is, though, that in debates, people get into preacher and prosecutor mode way too quickly. And so I like dances as an alternate metaphor, even though I have no rhythm. Because in a dance, you know that you're going to end up not just leading the whole thing, right? You're actually going to have to let your partner lead sometimes. You're going to have to sidestep. You may even improvise a little bit. And that may mean letting go of whatever script you thought you were going to follow. And I think when we try to have that constructive conflict, the most important thing we can do is approach it with humility. So, Holly, I will actually start, before we even begin a debate or a dance, I will say, hey, I just want you to know, I can be the world's most annoying prosecuting attorney. In fact, I've even been called a logic bully, and my wife had to explain to me that is not a compliment. And I don't want to be that person, right? I don't want to bully you with reasons and facts. I want to have a conversation where we learn from each other. So if you catch me doing that, please call me out. And people do call me out once I ask them to, and that's helpful. But the best part about it is when I admit that that's a foible of mine, the other person will often say, oh, well, you're a prosecutor? Well, guess what? I can be the most stubborn person on earth, and I don't want to be like that either. So let me know if I fall into that trap. And we are both entering the conversation committed to keeping an open mind, which is good for the kind of conflict that ensues.
Absolutely. I want to move to another part of the climate conversation. It's something that delegates touched on yesterday. There was a lot of conversations actually around the big targets that we've got in the world. Net zero by 2050 is one of the things we're talking about, the pathway to at this conference. And there was conversations on both sides. Is that far too ambitious a goal? Is that just being ridiculous? Or should we be even more ambitious? I mean, you've studied motivation extensively. You've done a lot of research on goal setting. How would you encourage us to think about ambition and aspiration when it comes to climate change and the power of these goals?
I think it's a really good question to ask because we know that when it comes to stretch goals, there's often a trade-off between meaning and manageability.
Yep.
Right? The higher you set the bar, the more meaningful the goal becomes, but the less manageable it becomes, and vice versa. And so we're always looking for, it's a bit of a tightrope walk, and we want to find the balancing point where it's both extremely meaningful and also at the edge of manageable. There's a psychologist, Gilbert Brim, who wrote eloquently about what he called just manageable difficulties and said what you want is a challenge that's right at the edge of what you think might be possible, or maybe just over the edge, because that's when you have to really rethink what kinds of solutions might be viable and focus your full attention on solving the problem. I think then the question is, well, how do you know if it's a just manageable difficulty? And I think net zero by 2050 is a great example of I don't know. We don't know whether it's doable. I think the research I think about here is there's actually classic evidence dating back to the 1950s that people are maximally motivated when they think there's about a 50% shot of success. And if you have a lot of experience or a base of success behind you, that number will actually get lower. And you're more comfortable than shooting for a 33% or a 25% chance of success. And so one thing I might do, knowing that it's impossible to find out right now, is that a feasible goal or not, is it too high or too low, is I might poll the Energy Disruptors and ask, okay, what do you think is the probability that we can hit this goal by 2050? And if the average estimate in the room is at 50% or above, I think you're probably setting your sights too low. I think if it falls below a quarter, you may be setting your sights a little bit too high for most people.
I appreciate that tolerance zone. I think that's really interesting. A follow-up question I wanted to ask to that is I think one of the reasons a lot of leaders are asking that is because they're respectively navigating their own company's reality or their personal role, whether it's family, community, organisation, whatever situation as a leader you might be in coming into the Energy Disruptors conversation. And they're thinking about, is it demotivating for my people? How do I get people to truly believe? Can you just talk to us a little bit about, particularly, I guess, in this context, I'm thinking about the timeline and how far away it is, and any view on how do we keep people motivated when the goal is so far away, it's hard to conceive of how what I'm doing today bears into it?
Yeah, I think we need small wins is the first step, right? So you want benchmarks along the way between now and 2050 that are signals of progress. Teresa Amabile has found that the single strongest predictor of daily motivation and joy at work is just a sense of momentum, right? That I have moved forward, that I've been able to check a box or cross something off of my to-do list. And so if you have these smaller milestones and you break up the big goal into these littler pieces, it's a lot more likely that people feel like, okay, I am on an upward trajectory and we are making progress toward this goal. I think beyond that, the other thing that I would love to see happen is I'd love to see some tangible, kind of more vivid and concrete versions of what does this look like if we achieve success in 2050. I think we're all tired of looking at polar bears on ice caps, right? But that image became a cliche for a reason because it really spoke to people. And we know that people are much more likely to care about the one human or the one animal that's at risk than they are to feel motivated about helping an abstract group of people or just trying to improve a series of outcomes for the planet at scale. And so I would think a little bit about who are the direct beneficiaries from a life standpoint of some of those small wins, and how can we make their stories and the impact on them more salient.
I want to come to a couple of other areas of your work. In option B, yourself and Sheryl Sandberg talk a lot about resilience and how we build resilience. And one of the through lines of certainly the conversation looking at the macroeconomic and geopolitical context yesterday was a lot about uncertainty and shocks and the challenges that sit in the near term and certainly in the longer term. What did you learn about building resilience that might be useful for our audience to hear?
I think that one of the real challenges a lot of us run into is when we're in a situation of high uncertainty, or worse yet, when we face tragedy or trauma, our first instinct is to say, well, I've never been through a situation like this before. And we saw this in the early days of COVID, right? A lot of people said, I don't know what to do. I've never lived through a pandemic before. And it is true, unless you're 103 years old, you probably have not lived through one. And even then, you probably don't remember it very well. But you know what? You have lived through the emotions associated with a pandemic. You have faced grief. You have faced loneliness. You have burned out. You have gone through something that I've been writing and speaking about a lot, languishing, that feeling of meh or blah. And if you focus on the inner experience as opposed to the outer circumstances, there's actually a lot you can learn from your own past resilience. So I like to ask people two questions. The first is, the last time you felt these emotions, what was it that helped you navigate them? And then can you apply some of your own wisdom? The second is, if you're having a hard time answering that, find somebody else who's facing a similar dilemma and give them advice for how to navigate it. And you will generally find the advice you give to others is the advice that you needed to take for yourself.
The other thing I just wanted to double click on there too is that notion of resilience for me, and then resilience for team, culture, company, community. I know you looked at that idea of how do we build resilient communities. It also strikes me whether we're talking about climate resiliency or resiliency to all manner of uncertainty. That's something we need to be thinking about how we do with and for one another. Any advice on how we scale that culture up?
Well, I think that collective resilience, more than anything else, boils down to hope. Right, which is the belief that we can work toward a brighter future. And I'm not talking about false hope, I'm talking about grounded hope, right? Which is that we not only have the will, but we also believe that there's a way, and we can begin charting that way. And I think that a lot of leaders, I've seen this a ton in the energy space, they're like, well, okay, we want to chart the way, so we're going to give people a bunch of micro steps that they need to take. And that just ends up having the unintended consequence of letting people feel micromanaged. Obviously, we know that people want more autonomy and freedom than that. And so instead of micromanaging, I think the best step for leaders is to macro-manage. To say, I want to show you the big picture. I want to give you a sense of how the work that you are doing individually actually fits into this collective purpose. And that's where collective hope comes from. People will find their own pathways, right, when they can see how these pieces fit together. I would love it if we had a few more macro managers and a few fewer micromanagers.
What gives you hope, Adam, at the moment?
I think what gives me hope more than anything else is the energy of young people. I just did a Rethinking episode with Mark Cuban where he said that he actually believes that Gen Z is going to be the greatest generation because of the hope that they have about solving the major problems in front of us. And as somebody who teaches a lot of 19, 20, and 21-year-olds, I feel that every day. I get hope from my students saying, hey, all these problems that other generations created, we're actually going to do something about them.
Really encouraging. I love hearing that. And we saw some of that energy on our stage and certainly in some of our breakouts here at the summit yesterday. I want to ask you about some of your commentary on leadership. You've said the ideal leadership style is not inspiring or authoritative or empowering, which is actually one we throw around a bit. It's adaptable. Why for you is that the most important?
Well, I think it's largely because I've seen so many leaders and gathered so much data at this point who just think that changing their mind is a sign of weakness. And what that means is they basically stick to their guns until it's too late, like we were talking about earlier. I think if you can adapt, you can learn every other skill that's important to succeed, right? And this is even one of the core principles of evolution, right? It's often been said that it's not the smartest or the strongest species that survives, it's the one that's best able to adapt to change. And so I think anybody who understands the importance of that idea of adaptability then is in a position to say, what does it mean to be an adaptable leader? And at its core, adaptable leadership is about recognizing how much uncertainty you are facing, right? To say, you know what, it is impossible for me to have all the answers to the problems I'm trying to solve. It's impossible for me to understand the jobs of all the people who are below me. And the more aware you are of that, the easier it is then to embrace change around you.
I want to ask you about one of your habits that I read about that I found really interesting, which is this idea that you've got an annual checkup in your diary where you get reminded to rethink what you're doing, how you're working specifically was the reference I saw to it. What's the origin of that habit in the diary, and how do you structure that so it's meaningful?
Well, I think we all know the importance of going to the doctor or the dentist for a regular checkup, even when nothing seems to be wrong. But it bothers me that we forget to do this with our careers and our lives. So I actually first read about this in research on marital checkups, where psychologists said, what if the conversations about what's going wrong in your romantic relationship and how to make it better didn't only happen when you were in the middle of a big fight? What if you had an annual checkup, and it turned out when couples were randomly assigned to do those annual checkups, their marriages became more resilient. They liked each other more. They had more constructive fights. They were more satisfied with how things were going. And I read that and thought, what if we did the same things with our jobs? I think it's so easy, Holly, to get stuck in a rut where you wake up one morning and you realize the last 7 years of my career are not what I wanted them to be. And a lot of people land there because they are afraid of having wasted the last 2 years. But you know what? I would say it's better to waste the last 2 years than it is to waste the next 20. And so for me, a career checkup is just a reminder in my calendar twice a year to rethink my values, my goals, and my habits. And I ask, okay, have my principles changed, right? For a long time, I said my values were helpfulness is number 1, excellence is number 2, integrity is number 3, and freedom is number 4. And then during one of these checkups, I realized that learning was not in that list, and that was a problem, and I needed a mechanism to then pursue that value, right? I was doing a lot of teaching, but very little learning. And that's why I started a podcast, to have an excuse to go out and learn from people and organizations that I thought could really teach me something exciting and useful. And then I would get to share those learnings with the audience. And they would actually get to learn with me as opposed to just from me after the fact. So that's the process in a nutshell. And a lot of the reflection is also asking, can I use this as an opportunity to reach out to my challenge network? So twice a year, I'll reach out to a bunch of my most thoughtful, disagreeable critics and ask them, what should I rethink? From our interactions, from what you've seen me share, from the work that I've done, what should I be questioning that I'm not? And that's invaluable input twice a year.
I love the idea of a challenger network, but also that way of engaging them, so it's actually meaningful and kind of structured in a way that can help and support you shifting. You talked earlier about kind of trust and psychological safety and the role that plays in making sure that we're surfacing different opinions and making sure that we're getting multiple perspectives on a particular issue or culturally within our organisations. I want to take you to the other side of that, which is, what if I'm the individual that is the different opinion, that is the unusual thinker, and I'm sitting in a company, in a community, in a family maybe, that does not view the world the same way as I do. I guess I want to come to some of your work in originals. What have you learnt about original thinkers, both in terms of things that might, let's start actually with things that might empower those original individuals to know, hey, they're not alone, and actually there's some method to the madness.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the first things to do is to recognize that when you're trying to have influence, especially upward influence, sometimes less is more. You don't have to give people 9 reasons to change. That just makes them more aware that you're trying to persuade them. It leads them to put their guard up, and then they can choose the least compelling reason and throw out your whole case based on that. And some of the data that I've collected has suggested that if you've got a resistant or a defensive audience, or even just a closed-minded one, that you're better off just giving your 1 or 2 most compelling reasons and then letting them react there. But I've learned over time that you don't even always need reasons at all. That sometimes you're better off asking questions than giving answers. And so, Holly, if I wanted to open your mind, let's say I've got an idea around renewable energy that I think you're going to be resistant to. I would come to you, and instead of saying, Holly, here's why I think this is a brilliant idea and you should immediately back it, I would say, all right, Holly, I've got this idea that I'm excited about around renewable energy, and I'm really worried that no one is going to give it a chance. I know that you're great at getting ideas heard and that people take your views really seriously. So could I get your advice on how to present this idea so that other people really open their minds to it? When I asked for your advice, a few things happened. One is I've just flattered you, right? We all admire the wisdom of people who come to us for advice. They're like, you're a genius. You knew to come to me. 2, we also then, I'm forcing you to take my perspective and walk in my shoes. And 3, then as you generate ideas for how to help me, you're taking some ownership and starting to commit to getting on board with this. And all of that is good for your openness. And I might also learn something from you, right? So I think that if you look at the data, advice seeking is the most underutilized strategy for getting your original idea heard by people who are more powerful than you or people who are not open to your point of view.
I love that answer, by the way. To come to another aspect of what you talked about in originals, you talked about original thinkers, you also talked about a lot of innovators. And we've talked a lot about innovation already over the program in terms of the innovation, the technological innovation, the cultural innovation that's going to be required to progress to net zero by 2050. I wanted to ask you, you talk about this term, precrastinators, and how important that is to an originals process. What do we need to understand about and facilitate space for, I guess, in a team or a working environment to make sure we're letting original innovators flourish?
All right, so we all know procrastinators. I'm the opposite. I'm a precrastinator. I like to submit things weeks or months early, and that's not to say I don't panic about deadlines. I just panic a few months ahead of the deadline. And I'll wake up tomorrow if we have a project due next year, worrying that it's not done yet. And I always thought that this was one of my best habits. I thought it made me productive and efficient and reliable. And then I had a super creative student, Jihei Shin, who told me that she had her most creative ideas when she was procrastinating. So I challenged her to test it, and she finds that sure enough, people who precrastinate like me are less creative than people who procrastinate sometimes. And of course, then I want to know, well, what about the chronic procrastinators who put things off all the time? And she's like, I don't know, they didn't fill out my survey.
There's a data issue there.
Eventually we got their data, and it turned out there was a nice curvilinear relationship. There's a sweet spot in the middle. If you wait too long, you just have to rush to implement your easiest idea. But if you're like me and you rush in and plunge in the moment you have an idea, you're not waiting for your best idea. You're basically getting seduced by your first idea. And so I think what I learned from that is that we sometimes need to let people put off, dare I even say procrastinate, when we need time to incubate. And I think the tricky thing about that is you can't afford to do that with every project you're working on. So I would reserve your procrastination or your incubation for the projects you're working on where you make decisions that are highly consequential and also irreversible, right? Big stakes, and you're about to walk through a door that locks behind you, not a revolving door. That's when you want to delay because it really matters, and you can't easily change your mind tomorrow.
Great point. Now, Adam, our time is drawing to a close, and I wanted to, I guess, finish with the theme of today within the summit's context, which is about brave leadership and the social transition. When you hear that phrase and you're talking to a room full of leaders and from across the world that are here passionate about this topic, what's your call for what they need to do more of, lean into? What do we need to see more of leaders at this moment in time to make these big, audacious goals a reality?
Well, I think that it takes humility and curiosity to think and learn, but it takes bravery and courage to rethink and unlearn. And I would ask every leader in this room, if you think about your most passionate beliefs about what's going to solve our climate crisis, what's going to bring us to an energy sustainable future, what are the ways that you might be able to question those beliefs? And is it possible then that asking that question will take you out of tunnel vision, widen your peripheral vision, and then ultimately make you aware of ideas that you did not give a chance before? And I think having the courage to rethink and unlearn, if I could offer leaders just one skill set, that would be the one that I bet on, because it allows you to get better at everything else that you do.
Have the courage to rethink. Well, what a phenomenal conversation. We've covered so many topics within the space of the time we've had with you, Adam. I love your insight, but also your pragmatism in terms of how you're able to boil it down to questions we can use to frame it, strategies, whether it's challenger networks or structures we can build into our team, the problem box and things like that. Thank you so much for being part of Energy Disruptors 2022. Can you join me in thanking Adam Grant?